Harvard University, or other affiliations. We are supported by voluntary contributions as well as by grants, and we disclose all of those on our websites. Just to say, we're committed to autonomy in our research and directions, and to transparency in our relationships. We will be happy to engage with anyone, but we do retain responsibility and control of the content of the product's results and deliverables. I and Sylvia and others who will speak today have no personal conflicts of interest with the presentation we're about to give. Next slide. So with that, let me say again, this is really our delight to introduce you to the clinical research glossary that we hope will start today and as being released with CDISC and for public comment. We will go through the process and say we're looking forward to this being a global and useful standard as we unfold its utility and abilities. Could I have the next slide? So the program today will be, after these brief introductory remarks from myself and from Dave Evans of CDISC, we will be giving the microphone over to Sylvia, who will give a glossary background and give through a bit of the development and introduce it to public review, and then introduce our co-presenters. I do want everybody to know that the recording, the slides, and a biographical sort of summary of each of the presenters will be available by the end of the week. If you registered for this conference, you will receive an email about that availability, and if not, we will announce it on our newsletter. If you have not signed up for our newsletter, the MRCTcenter.org, please do so that you could be aware of all the ongoing activities that occur, where we're pretty good about remembering to be transparent and sort of disseminate our resources, tools, and projects. Next slide. So the MRCT Center is delighted to welcome our panelists today. Sylvia Bedoff-Casas has been working with us for probably 5 years now, dedicated to health literacy and the patient participant experience, to plain language, and to advancing sort of patient engagement and participant engagement through the life cycle of clinical research. Bernard Coley will be talking to us at the end with Erin Mulbrat from NCI, who will also be addressing the utility and sort of thinking about the glossary as it evolves. Dave Evans, as I mentioned, will be presenting an introduction to CDISC, and we're delighted to have him and his ever so old picture being projected on this slide today. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. So the MRCT Center, for those who don't know it, is a research and policy center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, which is focused on addressing conduct, oversight, ethics, and the regulatory environment of clinical trials. The vision is really, and it was created to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. Clearly, what we do has an impact on the United States and the clinical trials we conduct here, but we don't do projects that don't have impact and sort of resonance in international work. And we do that by identifying emerging issues or persistently aggravating issues that remain unsolved in clinical research, thinking about defining the problem and scoping it so that we can really understand how to think through not just the definition of the problem, but what solutions could be ethical, actionable, and practical that we could offer as a way to get started. Could I go back? The way we do that is by involving everybody who is engaged in a problem around the table. Now, obviously, often a virtual table, but that includes patient advocates and organizations, industry, nonprofit groups, journal editors when it's relevant, such as in data sharing, academic partners, government, community representatives, and others. And we really do try to think about who's going to be impacted by, who is impacted by the problem and who could be helpful, accountable part of the solution, and who that solution will impact in turn. So you'll hear about that today, but it's been very much a participant-focused effort in the Global Clinical Research Glossary. Could I have the next slide? So just to say, we're not new to this game. We are not launching this glossary today. We are releasing it and establishing and announcing the collaboration with CDISC. We have had a long-standing commitment to health literacy. It started really with a number of projects that we had about initiatives to encourage and promote the return of both plain language summaries and individual research results to participants, and then realize that if you return those in anything other than a health literate way, a plain language, considering plain language, numeracy, imagery, etc., you really weren't communicating in a way that made that was impactful to the participant. That is when we started to the work on health literacy, which started actually years before we released or opened a publicly available health literacy in clinical research website, the source of which you can see here and the homepage you can see here. And that does go through all the principles, recommendations, and current learning, and we do keep that quite up to date. That then led, could I have the next slide, click, to a significant number of plain language participant-facing materials, such as a whole suite of research pamphlets, which we made available at the request of hospitals and clinical community sites to explain COVID-19 clinical research flyers. And that again led us to really think about not only the words we use, but the images and the way the information is presented, and made us quite sensitive to the complexity of health literate materials. Next slide, next click. So then we've been designing and delivering health literacy training. The we is rather empiric. It is really Sylvia who has really developed those trainings and delivered them. And we're happy to make those available to you as well. Next slide, click. We then launched the first pilot version of the clinical research glossary. That was done through an iterative process whereby a group of words were taken, a definition identified, and then serially and iteratively gone through rounds of review, including many stakeholders, patients, and their allies. The first group was released in 2021. You can see that each of them, and I should say Sylvia will review that again. Each of them has a image, and they're been really very, very well used and appreciated. And that led to an expansion, next click, of that effort to really try to make it a much more robust suite of and ongoing effort to develop the clinical research glossary. This is very, very much about clinical research. There are sites and there are dictionaries for medical terms, but not about clinical research. So that's what we undertook. And I have to say that in thinking about how this can be a standard, there was no better partner for us than CDISC. And with that, let me turn it over to Dave to give an introduction to CDISC, if I could.
Thank you, Barbara.
Great.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, MRCT, for allowing us to partner with you on this very important endeavor. So let me give you a little bit of background about CDISC and who we are, if those of you that do not know who we are. CDISC has been around for now, we're in our 23rd year. We're a standards development organization. CDISC stands for Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium. And really the history of this began back in the very late 1990s, in which a group of professionals came together in order to decide on data standards to be used for interoperability among organizations that then grew into the standards that we have today, such as SDTM and CDASH and ADAM and so on. And it wasn't really until probably 10, 15 years ago that then the FDA and regulatory agencies got involved in these standards. The ultimate goal was to have them as required methods of collecting and reporting and submitting information to the regulatory authorities. And that happened a number of years ago. So CDISC, what we do is we develop and advance the data standards primarily for the highest quality of data and integrity of the data and semantic interoperability of the data. And that is to transform this incompatible formats and inconsistent methodologies and diverse perspectives on information that we all collect as part of the science. And we build it into this framework for generating accessible clinical research data. It's even more important today as we have data sharing initiatives that are ongoing across the globe, and information that needs to be readily available to be harmonized and interoperable to make agile scientific decisions on that data. We convene a global community. We are a global organization, have a reach of number of different experienced professionals that are part of our network, part of our community. And most importantly, we're a standards development organization that is open, transparent, and we provide public comment back on these standards. So we have quarterly reviews or more often reviews, depending on the subject that we're pushing for standardization. CDISC has always been an evolving transformational standards organization for this information used in clinical research and regulatory submission. Next slide, please. So one thing that you should know about is CDISC is not a standalone organization. We are an alliance and collaborations with a number of global organizations. If you notice in the upper right-hand corner, our collaborations with regulatory agencies, certainly FDA, PMDA in Japan, EMA in Europe, and NMPA in China. For FDA and PMDA, our standards are required. They're mandatory for submission of clinical information for drug approval process, working closely with EMA in a similar vein, and certainly with NMPA in China. Also, we have this partnerships with certain therapeutic areas or patient advocacy groups in which we develop standards for those certain therapeutic areas. We have some 50 therapeutic area focused guides, implementation guides that tell about how to use the standards for those indications and those therapeutic areas. And we partner with these organizations in order to bring them forward. Certainly NCI, Erin will talk later about NCI and our partnership with NCI, also with Transalry Biopharma, in which we're innovating on new ways to look at clinical research information for trial design and protocol assessments. And lastly, but not least, is we partner with other standards development organizations such as DICOM and ISO and IHE and HL7 and FUSE organization in order to make sure that we collaborate on the focused area that we are in. So certainly CDISC is in clinical research and drug trials and the data necessary for submission of that information to regulatory authorities. But we also have this edge with HL7 and the Vulcan project for clinical research information as coming from real world data sources such as EHRs and the like. And it's important that CDISC as a standards development organization partner with others in order to ensure that we have high quality, interoperable data for use in the scientific community. Next slide, please. Certainly CDISC standards, while they're mandatory for clinical research, submission of clinical research information to regulatory authorities, they're also used by other organizations such as the US NIH for many kinds of medical research. I mentioned NCI, where our control terminologies are in the NCI EVS. We've worked on a bridge model, which is a unifying reference model for clinical research information, and also some data sharing projects that are ongoing. And you can see the other centers with NIH employ our standards for use within those clinical trials. Next slide. Also in Europe, where we have partners and have been working with organizations in order to promote standards for real world use, you can see a number of the projects that are out here for infectious disease, for mobile patient reported outcomes, EHRs, interaction with EHRs, and also for vaccine standards. CDISC is what we're evolving in the past few years is not just on the clinical research end, but also the implementation of those standards for real world use. Next slide. So CDISC is not a small organization. We have over 540 members. It's growing every week, every year. It bridges the gamut from regulatory agencies to academic institutions, pharmaceutical, biotech, devices, and service providing organizations and technology providing organizations. We bring this community together in order to promote the use of the standards for the entire clinical data information flow from beginning to end. Next slide, please. I'm going to tell you a little bit about, while we're a standards development organization, we have to have the machinery internally in order to provide these standards for use. Historically, what we produced was implementation guides, which were PDF files or Excel spreadsheets in order for organizations to take that information and then interpret it in their own way. But we've realized in the last 4 or 5 years that that's just not enough, that we have to have the technology framework, the foundational framework for this information to be shared in a machine readable format, to be consumed by the various solution providers and technology providers, and be embedded within the systems. So we started on this process of building what we call the CDISC library, and it provides the foundation for all of our standards, not just the ones that are required by FDA or PMDA, but also for use across the whole clinical research spectrum. While the top part talks about the CDISC library, machine executable content, control terminologies, and standard metadata and API, this serves as the basis for all the content that then you see underneath of it in the boxes below it. Next slide, please, or build. So what you see here is it's important that control terminology serves as a basic component of standards. What we're talking about today is a glossary of controlled terminologies. Ern will talk about the control terminology process. It's important that when we talk about standards in its basic form, that we have the same language that we're using, the same structure that we're using, the same technical specifications that we're using in order for a machine to then interact with that information so that there is interoperability between systems. And you can see through the use of APIs that then these then connect to various other systems downstream. In fact, what we've stood up in the last 2 years is a CDISC Open Source Alliance, or we call COSA, in which we've brought together open source solutions that are using these standards for any number of use cases within clinical research, whether it be for transformation of data or analysis and reporting, tables, listings, and figures, case report forms for the community. They are all open sourced and freely available at our COSA website. Also, what's important when you talk about standards is the verification of the information that is then standardized. If you're just saying that it's a standard, you have to then make sure that it is conforming to those standards. And we started this project 2 years ago to build what we call CORE, or the CDISC Open Rules Engine, in which we have now machine readable rules that can be employed for any use cases within clinical research. The first ones are certainly for the submission of information to regulatory authorities, but it goes beyond that. It can be used in data collection systems, or reporting systems, or data sharing systems. And our hope is that the community will take this scripting language and the rules engine and make it part of this interoperability of information with systems. And then last, about 5 years ago, we started this project called CDISC 360, in which it's not now the definition of the individual elements, or what we call biomedical concepts, and taking those and standardizing them, not just collections of concepts, but the concepts themselves, so that we understand as we move from one venue of information to another, that the attributions of that information stays the same. So you can think of a biomedical concept of blood pressure, but it's built up of a number of different elements that go into blood pressure: systolic and diastolic blood pressure, the units, the method, the cuff size, the position of the body. All those form a concept called blood pressure. And what we're doing is then standardizing not only the terminology and the nomenclature and the structure, but also how it interacts or how it relates to other biomedical concepts. You see on the other boxes below, some of them I'll call out in the second column, third row, where we have study design metadata, project we're working with Transalriated right now, and also with the ICH M11 group, or the International Conference on Harmonization M11 group, on a common protocol design, so that there is a common protocol definition that would be standardized. The templates would be standardized for use, and this then would become a CDISC standard going forward. And then on the third column's third row, where we have trial master file reference, last year we added to our family the trial master file reference model, in which we're pleased to expand the reach of CDISC into more operational data of collecting the attributes and the standardization of those attributes for use in clinical research. Next slide, please. So I want to end with, give you an idea of our short-term strategy, but it leads into a longer-term strategy for CDISC. We're moving towards providing all the standards in machine-readable and technology framework for these standards metadata implementations. What's that means is that while we can all read what a standard is in a PDF document or a Word document, that's not enough. We have to get the implementation standardized, not just the terminology standardized, so that as information flows in today's technology world, that it moves the same meaning, the semantic interoperability of that. We can also say that we want to expand the development of these biomedical concepts and trial design and protocol models, so that you get the standards further and further upstream upon the definition of a protocol or what a trial actually is, so that information gets embedded in a standardized and a harmonized fashion as it moves through the process. We've created a digital data standards framework to accommodate multiple data collection settings and modalities for real-world data. We partnered with Open Clinica and REDCap in order to standardize the case report forms for clinical research and make it natively available in their formats for the research community. Certainly to expand our standards to address the challenges of real-world data. We can talk about clinical research data in a regulatory grade for regulatory submission of information, but some of those rules get broken when you're talking about real-world data collection, missing data, time point analysis, inclusion and exclusion criteria that may not be met in truly real-world data. How does that then affect the models that we have for regulatory submission? And we want to maintain this contextual integrity while expanding the reach of these standardized control terminology. And a perfect example of it is what we're talking about today, is the glossary for MRCT and how it can be incorporated into what the broader reach of the CDISC control terminology is. And finally, we're expanding our standard development and maintenance to support clinical operations and additional therapeutic areas. You can think of CDISC as now not just a standards development organization, but a standards governance organization in which we're taking on other standards that have been stood up in a volunteer setting and moving them to a more formalized practice underneath of the umbrella of CDISC. So I want to thank you all, and I hope that you find this webinar very educational and useful for MRCT. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was just a wonderful introduction to CDISC. Could I have the next slide? And you'll see immediately why we saw the benefits of collaboration. For the clinical research glossary itself, it will sort of enable consistency so that when a participant or a public member or patient hears a word, it means the same thing, whether I say it or a pharmaceutical company says it, or a institution says it, or they read it in their patient gateway. It'll be accurate to the extent that we can understand it and express it. It will be reliable, and there'll be a transparency to how it's used. And hopefully it will also lead to trustworthiness as we all start to communicate in the same way about the same things. Could I have the next? And the reason that we thought that the CDISC collaboration was just so important was that it gives us really a global means for disseminating the glossary, for including all folks that have touch on the sort of communication in clinical research. It gives us a long-term governance structure, which we can work with CDISC. It leads to interoperability between regulatory submissions, for instance, and the participant-facing and public-facing materials that are related to those submissions. And it leads to efficiency. Every company, every institution or community center doesn't have to begin by starting with creating their own glossary or dictionary. It leads to those kinds of efficiencies and activities. And with that, let me say again how appreciative we are to CDISC, and let me introduce Sylvia, who will take you through the guts of the work we're doing.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you, Dave, for that wonderful intro. Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to talk a little bit about the background of the glossary. And in the course of doing that work and telling you a little bit about our process, and then also about public review, I will along the way also be bringing along Bernard Coley, who's a wonderful work group member who's working on the development team right now for the glossary as a patient caregiver advocate. I believe his spouse is here in the audience today too. Welcome, Denise. And he'll be sharing some of his perspectives of working on this glossary. And also Erin Wilbrett, who is my compatriot at CDISC. She's with NCI Enterprise Vocabulary Services, and she and I are working together on this piece, and she'll talk a little bit more about the public review process. So with that said, with that intro that Barbara had given, it was before 2020 when we looked. There was no resource that we could find of consistent, accurate, simplified research definitions for the research industry to use. And so at that point, that health literacy and clinical research work group kept calling for developing a unified approach that best supports patients, participants, and their caregivers in the form of a plain language, understandable, designed for patient-centric clinical research glossary. So we made it our mission to co-create such a thing with patients, participants, and caregivers at the table with us, designing it explicitly for public understanding, but working towards a resource that would be accepted by industry and academic stakeholders across the ecosystem to be able to facilitate bi-directional communication around research. Next slide, please. And so we went forth at the beginning of the pandemic to pilot this. We had a wonderful work group of folks who, when we did this, Zoom was kind of new and everyone was excited to meet on a weekly basis and have these conversations. And we not only did we pilot sort of coming up making not like a definition, but also the process, the whole process of who are we bringing to the table? How are we having these conversations? And I will say, I see someone else in our audience as well, Rob Wecker from back in those days working on this with us, who really pushed us to think about the charter, the plan, the scope of work. What are we working on here? And so we worked as a wonderful team to come up with the original 53 definitions. In 2021, we released those on this website. And we also have a paper, if you're interested in learning more about what the process was that we really went through. We have that in the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science. It's open access, and Kaylee is also putting the link into the chat right now. Next slide, please. And so what I want to highlight for everyone who may not be so familiar with the glossary yet is that what we were discussing and debating and working on was, yes, a plain language definition, which you can see would be at the top of every web page for each term, but also all the additional information and other resources we might want to link to. And this is pretty small right now, so I'll just walk you through just the main elements. At this point, we have an auditory pronunciation guide included. We have an image or graphic for every word to help with visual cues in learning, associative learning, extra context, and just increased engagement. We have a use in a sentence, the contextual use, more info if we want to dig a little deeper, and then words related to randomization, words opposite, which I'll come back to in a second, and then other resources, reputable resources, often FDA, NIH, other large organizations that have created additional resources that people might want to be able to link to and dig into if they're really interested. I'll note that words opposite is an area that you see is blank here and is blank for many of our words. And so what we have taken as a suggestion from a few of our work group members, Bernard being one of the ones who championed this idea, is being able to include additional personalized context. When might you see the word randomization used? What questions might you ask if you see randomization in that study document that you're reviewing? So for example, a prompt might be, if you see randomization, am I going to be randomized? Is randomization a part of my study that I'm going to be part of? What does that mean for me as a participant if my study is randomized? So it'll give some prompting questions to hopefully, again, lead to some ability to have more engaged conversation around clinical research. And our audience for this glossary, I really want to reiterate that, is patients, participants, caregivers, and the public, but also people who create research materials for a non-technical audience who may not be so familiar with clinical research, and research sponsors and researchers who can use common language in their communications and again, have that consistent approach to the terminology and the definitions they're using. Next slide, please. So just say that our activities this year are to define 150 new words that are being added to the glossary by the end of the year. And we are at like 120 right now, so we're very close. We have this wonderful diverse work group that is comprised of two streams, work streams, a development team, which is over 20 members, multi-stakeholder, industry, medical writing, nonprofits, CROs, all working together and including our valuable patient caregiver advocates. I think I saw that Marilyn Knott is also in the audience today, and she's my co-lead, and she's here cheering on Bernard as well. So, we have wonderful advocates at the table. And we also have CDISC representatives who, as of January 2023, are also part of the team. So Rebecca, I see you here too. And Aaron, we have wonderful membership to be able to integrate CDISC perspectives already early in the definition process. We also have a wonderful smaller work stream that is entirely comprised of patient caregiver advocates. And those folks are there to really think about the patient and participant when they get those definitions and additional content, and is that definition really acceptable? So we already have a robust two-pronged work stream in advance of what comes next in terms of refining and finalizing definitions. And we do our work through monthly written feedback, which is collected by a cloud-based Google workbook where folks put in their feedback, and I review it with Kaylee, our project manager who works with me on this. And we also then lead consensus conversations on a monthly basis to have the conversations, the enlightening, sometimes challenging conversations to get to our definitions. Next slide, please. So when we get there, it'll show this nice little timeline. We select, define, refine, finalize, release. And next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit about defining and what we do to define. We make sure it's plain language. We focus on single sentence definitions, no complex sentences, no long sentences, conversational tone, no words or terms that change the message of the sentence, and active voice whenever possible. And so we really focus on that for our plain language definition when we're defining and creating that. And on the next slide, you'll see our refining process is when we're having our conversations and we're really focused on, can I accept this definition? Is it clear? Is it accurate? Is it consistent with other similar glossary definitions that we might have, related terms? Plain language is being used. Is it understandable? Is it agreeing with other authoritative definitions, which now includes a check against the CDISC definitions, since we're coding against those? Context, and again, if there's any other concerns to be noted that we must discuss. And then we really ask ourselves, even if it's not perfect, because perfection will never happen with something like language that is dynamic, that we have a lot of context to put in and consider. We ask ourselves, can I accept this definition, and move towards at least 80% agreement. And we almost always get over 100%. We get 100%, always over 80%. Next slide, please. And so at this point, having outlined this process here, I want to give Bernard a few moments to share a little bit about his experience in doing this and what makes this process work, how he's engaged with it, and what this means for patients and participants. Thank you, Bernard, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sylvia and Barbara and Dave, for this opportunity to represent a special class of people, the impactees. And for those of you who think of the impactees as a they group, just remember at some point in your life, all of us are going to be a member of that group. And so this work is absolutely critical to you, regardless of what your current status is. So I'm here to talk a little bit as both a patient advocate and again, an impactee about this process and why this is so important. I have to tell you, I'm on a number of patient panels. I'm doing a lot of work on engaging underengaged communities, things like that. But this particular project, go back a screen, is the most exciting project I worked on. And I can summarize why in one statement. You can't have informed consent if you don't understand what you're consenting to. So I may sign a document, but you don't really have informed intent. So let me take a minute and give you focus on two particular issues that have been brought up by a number of members who spoke, a number of panelists who spoke this morning. So what makes this process work? And I want to emphasize a couple of items in it. We don't just focus on coming up with a simple definition. This isn't an exercise in dumbing down a medical term, a medical research term. This group, which is comprised with a significant number of patient advocates, as well as professionals from various parts of the industry, we spent a lot of time considering robust discussions of how this will be used, where it will appear, where people will find it, and taking a look at the context, or if you will, putting yourself in the shoes of the recipient. How do they come to this? What does this mean to them? Is this definition going to help someone understand? So let me take a second and say, there is actually, from the standpoint of the patient or the impactee community, only one use case. Can I understand what this means to me? What is the risk? What is the benefit? How is this going to help me live a better life? There is no other use case when we're coming here, when we're looking at these documents. I'm trying to figure out, how is this going to help me? And so the most important things from that perspective are, tell me about this process that you use to reach these definitions. Can I trust it? For many people, their perspective on these kinds of activities are their experience with the law, where you can read the law and go to court and find out you have absolutely no understanding of what was really meant. You look at your insurance documents, you can't understand them. So there's a healthy amount of skepticism that comes from the community. And so what's important is for them to hear and understand the process by which we arrive at these definitions and what that means. Can I actually trust this? So what I want to share with you also is in our process, there is a healthy respect for lay perspectives. And when I say lay perspectives, by the way, I'm not talking about uninformed, unexperienced people. Some of the volunteer patient advocates on our panels are professionals themselves who've been through the clinical trial process, who've actually conducted them, who've spoken before the FDA, who are part of writing policy. But now they're on the other side of the fence as an impactee. And so it is really important that the perspectives we bring are part of the decision-making process. And I'm here to vouch for the fact that there is a healthy respect for those perspectives as they're brought to the table as part of this process. And again, that helps me to communicate that you can trust the output of this process. And the final piece, which Sylvia mentioned a couple of times, there is a very healthy diversity of experience perspectives. Experience from the standpoint of generating clinical research studies, defining them, writing the documents, writing the patient facing materials, and consuming those particular perspectives. So what makes this process work? It is a healthy, strong, vibrant process. We're excited. We're very excited, I'll say, from the patient community about this collaboration with CDISC. And here's what it means. It means that these definitions I can, again, rely on. They're validated. They make sense both from the medical side and from my understanding as an impactee. They're trustworthy. And the process by which this definition was arrived at, these supporting materials, I know they've been vetted. And we're very excited about the public review process being added to this. So I know that this isn't a bunch of people who went off into the closet, who are specialists, maybe in some academic center, and they came up with this definition and they said, here, I've got the answer to all your problems, which we all know is generally not the case. I know that these have been vetted. I know that not only when I finish looking at these as a patient advocate, some of the others, a whole bunch of people had a chance to do it. Okay? And that's very, very reassuring. And the last piece I'll mention is, it was mentioned a little bit earlier, but I want to highlight it here and lift it up. And that is the bi-directional knowledge exchange. So it's important to know both the medical scientific context in which some of these terms are coming up, but it's also extremely important for those people to understand the lived experience under these things and the context in which these definitions and materials will be consumed. And this we're guaranteeing now with having to meet standards and protocols as defined by CDISC, that there's this bi-directional knowledge exchange and that it's being respected and included. So with that, I'll say again, thank you on behalf of the impacted community, the advocates, et cetera, for allowing us to be part of this and for the opportunity this morning to share this with you and how important this development is to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for your enthusiasm and your passion and your commitment to this work and allowing us to have the luck to be working with you. I think this is bi-directional in every sense of the word. We are all so lucky to have the members of the work group that we have, and we're so grateful to you for your expertise and sharing that with us always, monthly and today. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'll just note that what's added into our process is the CDISC public review. I see a question from Thomas as well around the CDISC partnership and the terms being mapped to existing standards for clinical or medical terms. Yes, The C code will be enabled. It is a technical terminology now, technical standard, and our plain language definitions are coded to the C code terms that are defined in the CDISC glossary. And Erin can say a bit more to that as well as we move through. Next slide, please. And so what we want to do now is I'll introduce Erin. Hello, Erin. And she'll just spend a few moments walking through the public review process. You can tell us a little bit about why we do it, what it is, and then there's a few slides just to give people an idea of how to do it. It's pretty simple. And then we'll be able to wrap up with some concluding thoughts and time for some questions and answers.
So thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, and thanks all. I'm really excited to talk to you about this public review process today. And this is really what makes a standards development organization a standards development organization. CDISC is an SDO, and one of the hallmarks of being an SDO is that thou shalt do public reviews of all of the standards that you're putting out. So this is a very, very critical step in anything that CDISC does, including CDISC controlled terminologies, of which MRCT is folded into the CDISC terminology family now. But this part of the process wherein public review happens is critical to CDISC maintaining its SDO-ness, I guess one would say. But it's also really, really important, you know, as Bernard so wonderfully said, we've got great diversity in our working groups. And I really, really like meeting MRCT and meeting, you know, the folks at MRCT and meeting that working group. You know, I have such faith that what they are putting out there is really, really great content. But this is just yet another check in the process, making sure that that group of highly talented and diverse people did their jobs and got to that, you know, definition writing is an art, right? So making sure that those folks did get to where they needed to go to make sure that everybody is understanding this term. So I'm going to talk to you really briefly about the CDISC public review process. So in order to participate in the CDISC public review process, you must register an account with CDISC. This is a free process. It happens very, very quickly, but it's a process that you can just start off with by simply, if Kaylee gives you this slide, or you can go to the links after the fact is fine too when you get the slides. But if you get onto that page and you do not yet have a CDISC account, it's going to tell you, hey, sign up for a CDISC account here. So I'm hoping that you all are maybe starting to do that while I am discussing this. But thou shalt register, get a CDISC account to be able to access all of this stuff. What's great recently is that CDISC did have a sort of one username, one password registration thing in order to, so that you, once you've registered, you can access all of the standards content on the CDISC website. You can access the CDISC wiki, where all the CDISC teams are developing the CDISC standards. And you can also access, very importantly, the CDISC JIRA project. And it's through the CDISC JIRA project that you should be submitting your public review comments. So you're going to go to this page, you're going to register for that account. And then you're going to go to this page. And this page is basically the announcement page for CDISC controlled terminology, package 54, public review. And at the bottom of this page, this is a screenshot, but if you get to this page live, you're going to scroll down to the bottom of the page and you're going to see you're going to see a bunch of Excel files. One of those Excel files is called terminology _ P54 _ MRCT. And that's where you're going to access that first batch of 53 MRCT plain language or not terms, I guess the terms are the terms, but they're plain language definitions. And that's the file you're going to be reviewing. Next slide, please. So 3 basic steps here. You're going to go and you're going to access that wiki page. Step 2 is going to be to download that Excel workbook. And we want you to be reviewing the definitions. Reviewing the terms as well is going to be helpful too. to make sure that the term and the definition really fit together. Sometimes you might look at the definition and say, oh, there, maybe need to be more added based on the granularity of the term, or vice versa. Or the term needs to maybe be refined based on the granularity of the definition. So we're looking for all kinds of feedback like that. And then we're hoping that you will have comments. So if you have comments, I'm going to show you how to submit those through JIRA in a second. But if you don't have comments, you like what you saw and you did review it, we would love for you to go to the bottom of that wiki page that was on the previous slide and hit, there's a little button on there at the very, very bottom that says like. We'd love you to like it. I checked this morning and there was already one like on the page. So thank you for that. So it looks like we've already had somebody look at the file and see nothing and like it. That's great. We'd like to see that. I'm going to say this again, but if you have any difficulty whatsoever with this process, just access, can't get a JIRA account for whatever reason, you can always provide feedback by email to me directly. I can be your person. I can either answer any questions you may have about getting access or point you to where things are if it's not clear, or I can literally submit the feedback through JIRA on your behalf as well. I'm here to support you. Next slide. Great. So this is what JIRA looks like. And I do want to, a great little navigation hint at the top left of the screenshot there, you see a little 3x3 matrix. Once you get access, to see these CDISC sites, you can actually click on that little 3x3 matrix at the top left, and you can actually toggle between the CDISC wiki, CDISC.org, and CDISC JIRA project. So that's a really easy way to kind of get through those three websites that you're going to be interested. But what we're going to do in order to submit a comment, it's fairly straightforward. You're going to navigate to that CDISC JIRA page. We're showing it to you here. We've also given you the link. It does require that login, which is going to be given to you when you register to get a CDISC account. Once you are logged in, you're going to hit that create button, that blue button with the red arrow at the top of the page. Next slide. Then there's going to be a number of pieces of information that we would like you or need you to fill in order for your comment to get to the right place. So the project, you should be picking the project called, that's the box at the top, that's the project called controlled terminology. Just heads up that there are lots of projects in the CDISC JIRA space. But the project that we're specifically interested in here for MRCT is the Controlled Terminology Project. The issue type should be set to review comments. I think that's set by default. If it's not, that's not a big deal. You can change it or you can just ignore that one. Next, summary, the summary field, that's a free text field. So that's basically a short summary of, if you do have a comment, it might be a short summary of, refine the definition of adverse event, or clarify the definition of, single blind study, whatever. So that's that summary field, very, very short and concise, is what we're expecting there. The next box that we really need you to fill in is that it's called the components box. That basically indicates, that box just indicates which terminology you are reviewing. As you saw in a couple of previous slides, there's a lot of files out for CDISC package 54 controlled terminology public review. So for this one in particular, and this, what we're talking about today, you're going to, in the drop down, you're going to want to click on MRCT. That's how we know that what you're commenting on is in that MRCT file. The next critical piece of information we need is this piece of information right below that called package. That is also a drop-down box that contains numbers. I think we started working in JIRA back in like package 30 something. So you're going to see a bunch of numbers. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see number 54. That's the package we're in. And you're going to click that and put that into the package, into that box as well. And then we're going to give you a free text field, that field called description there. And that's going to be where you're going to, as clearly as possible, you're going to tell us what you want changed, what you don't like, what you would prefer to see within a definition or term, etc. Review period, that this is not a huge deal. You could set it to public review if you wanted to. We're still going to see it regardless of what is in that box. So that box isn't really important down there. Next slide, please. Okay, next we can ignore the labels field at the very bottom. And then you have successfully created a comment. So you can either just hit that blue create button at the very bottom, or you can click the button next to it that says create another. And again, I will say, if you have any trouble at all with any of this, you're going to email me and reach out and I'm going to fix it for you, okay? Next slide, and I think that's my bit done. But CDISC also very kindly made a video that shows exactly how to do all of that. That's going to be in the slides as well. So I think that's it for how to submit a public review comment. Sylvia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thanks for walking everyone through. So on the next slide, I will just say, we're going to do our public review feedback. We're going to see what comes in and we're going to work on it. We're going to continue developing definitions. We're going to prepare for June's public review to get all those additional definitions we've defined out into public review for you then. We're working on a new website internally here, MRCT Center's Glossary website with better functionality, improved functionality and usability. And we'll release all of this with the CDISC plain language standard at the end of 2023 with ongoing considerations for translation into additional languages. We're certainly not forgetting this. This is an important piece, both for American, national, non-English speakers, English language learners, and also internationally, obviously. Next slide, please. So this is an amazing opportunity for us to broaden dissemination, learn more from our users. We're going to keep working together to release these terms and standards by the end of the year, and we'll continue working on more words in 2024 and beyond. And so I saw some questions, a question about other types of definitions and terms, safety terms we might be considering defining in the future. Certainly, we're open to hearing what the needs are and what would be beneficial to the community. And we encourage you to take part in the public review and use the glossary. So we're at the top of the hour. We've been answering questions in the Q&A. I know many people will likely have to drop off, but I do want to make sure I at least thank our amazing, wonderful panelists today. Dave Evans, Bernard Coley, Erin Wilbrod, thank you for being here today. Barbara, thank you for moderating and getting us started. And if folks do want to linger, we can answer any question or whatever, but if folks have to drop off, obviously, please do not hesitate to drop off. And in the next slides, I'll just say a few things quickly, because I wanted to make sure I note before everyone leaves. Thank you. We couldn't do this without our expert advisory committee. Next slide, please. The original pilot members of the work group, and next slide, and our current amazing work group. All of these names, all of these people are contributing to this glossary to make it what it is. So we're so extremely grateful. Next slide, please. So no time for questions, but next slide. Thank you so much for being here. Follow us and email us. We will answer any additional questions you have, and we'll be more than happy to give you more information about the glossary.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you to Sylvia for leading this effort for many, many years now, and to all your collaborators and all of our supporters. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, MRCT. We're looking forward to our partnership going forward.
That's our way.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful week. Enjoy your holidays if anyone's celebrating, and take care.
It's an